So thanks, everybody. Once again, we're jumping into our next session now on journalism and democracies under pressure. Let me please welcome again Jessica Jarrett from Voice of America, who will moderate this session. Thanks very much, Jessica.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. So when the Hungarian President Viktor Orbán addressed the US CPAC conservative organization last year, he said that the path to power is through media ownership. And this is something that we've seen authoritarian leaders lay the groundwork for years, using anti-national accusations, calling media bias, making us the foil to their election campaigns. As democracy registers its 17th consecutive year of decline on media freedom at threat globally, what does that mean for us when we're trying to cover elections? I'm joined today by 5 journalists in the thick of election campaigns, either in the middle of it with Turkey or with elections coming up or just past, who are going to share their experiences of what they're seeing with these authoritarian tactics that have been in play for many years now, and looking at what media can do. How can we tackle that? How can we avoid being pulled into those conversations, rise above it to ensure that our audiences have access to independent media? Okay, so our panelists today, because I'm forgetting everyone's name, we have from Turkey, Semdem from Turkey, Die Spiegel, Paula from Nexo Journal in Brazil, Supir Sharma, who's the executive editor of Scroll in India, and Alexandria Sobczak from Gazeta Wyborcza, which I nearly said correctly. As I said, Semdem is joining us from Turkey. They're in the middle of their runoff elections, and I feel like Erdogan has really started this long lead up to media capture in particular, owning about 95% of media in Turkey, either through hostile takeovers or pro-government friends buying this media. What does that look like when you go into the elections this year? Has there been any space for independent reporting? Is the opposition able to be heard within that environment?
Well, actually, the way it played itself out, very well seen in the results of the first round. We've seen, I think when I think about this entire thing of freedom of expression, free media, especially through living the example of Turkey, I see how important media ownership law is. Of course, it's the acknowledgement and recognition of the public to hold on to its right to information, but how you give out that information, how they access that information is as important as that recognition of the right. As you said, 95% of the media being in hands of the government means that they are capable of drumming any narrative that they please. Some may say, the traditional media is dying, there is less trust in mainstream media, but what happens is that this narrative is put out in the mainstream channel, later to be picked up in social media, later to be picked up in any outlet through the networks that are built by the government sources. Or either vice versa. It gets cooked in social media, then picked up mainstream channels. So there is this constant cycle of narratives of disinformation floating around. And in Turkey, in this election, we have this 6-party opposition coalition that tried to send their message out through their party establishments throughout Anatolia. But when you look at, Turkey is not Istanbul, Turkey is not Ankara. We're talking about a country of 85 million people in a vast geography. So when you look at the media habits of people in heartland Anatolia, you see that their main sources of information is still the public channel, because that's what they're used to. That's what they've seen from their parents, that's what they're following up. Yes, the internet use is high in a country like Turkey. Smartphone ownership is reaching out to 90%, but what do you do with internet? What do you do with that smartphone is important. Do they use it to access news reports? No, they use it in their different ways. So in Heartland Anatolia, for example, TRT, the public broadcaster, is still the main source of news gathering for people. And there was an interesting analysis between 1st of April and 1st of May, and the first round of elections was on 14th of May, to find out how much space the politicians were given on TRT public channel. It shows that the main opposition presidential candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, was given 32 minutes in 1 month versus Tayyip Erdogan of 32 hours. So how can you compete with that? You can't. So you have to look out for alternative ways. The journalists are looking for alternative ways. I mean, the way journalists operate is already a suffocating environment, so they're turning out to their own media channels on YouTube or on other platforms. But in the end, it's all about changing people's habits to access reliable news and to make them realize that they need good information, they need to access reliable information to make their lives better.
Based on what you've seen on the election campaign, you've been out reporting, are you seeing that any of those independent voices or coverage of the opposition is being picked up by people who live, like you say, outside the big metro centres? Or are you seeing more like a parroting of like what Erdogan and his party are pushing? Is that narrative just being clearly heard?
Unfortunately, that constant drumming of one narrative by this majority of the media landscape had polarized Turkey in ways that has never happened before. So people are identified by their parties, people are identified by the TV stations they follow, social media personalities they follow. So unfortunately, I mean, when I traveled during the election campaign and went to cities, it was such stark difference between what people talked. I mean, when I went to sort of pro-government fronts, I could hear people speaking like the news bulletin of the TV stations. Unbelievable. Their priorities were the same as being told them in news bulletins. And then when you go to opposition circles, of course, life got more real. I mean, for example, the main election narrative of the government was that this election was a battle fought against the evil West trying to divide Turkey. So, but we're talking about this in a country where inflation is higher than 40–50% in the street. So people have lesser means, there's high rates of unemployment, high rates of inflation, expenses are getting high. So how come people are not talking about what they need versus speaking about what the state needs, like security, but we're talking about national security. So yes, I could see it very clearly in the field how people were polarized and how reality took over as less exposed you are to those mainstream channels.
Thanks. Paula, I'm going to come to you next for Brazil. You just had elections where Bolsonaro, for years, had really just picked a fight with media. Media have become like a big foil for him to just cast you as the enemy and just accuse you of bias. Going into your elections, how hard was it to move away from that narrative and actually just report what was happening, to not sort of have to be on the back foot and defending yourselves as journalism, just doing your job?
Yeah, good morning, and good morning to all of you. I'm very happy to be in an all-female panel. Unfortunately, this is not, it doesn't reflect the industry. Just a quick note, please read the Reuters report on women, particularly in roles of leadership within the industry. I think we should make a public commitment to change the landscape for women and people of color within the journalistic industry. So to talk about Brazil, I think that we had for 4 years very tough period for journalism because of the Bolsonaro government. Of course, I cannot blame him alone, but I can blame him a lot. He has been actively attacking journalists as a strategy, and in a very specific way, female journalists. I think that they have very soon managed and mastered, actually, the language of social media platforms, something that it took a while for other people and other parties to master. And I think that as a consequence, the idea that journalism equals an opinion, that facts doesn't matter anymore, became extremely popular in Brazil. And that journalists had an agenda, a hidden agenda, became also very popular in Brazil. We had 4 years that where we had a pandemic also that killed more than 700,000 people in Brazil, where disinformation played a big role. And he was a leader in that regard as well, refusing, being very anti-vax, refusing, saying that he wasn't vaccinated. So it was a big mixture of politics. We had an economic crisis, a political crisis, and a sanitary crisis that took over the country, where misinformation in general was the rule. What happened in the election, this current election, that I think the country was better prepared, but not entirely. And what I like to bring here is to reflect a little bit on the role of the media, because I think that we will have elections every 4 years, and we need to think about what's our role in this, because I think that we all face this kind of challenges all over the world. And by the way, I think that we're talking about democracy under pressure. It would be wonderful to have here people from the US, from France, from other countries, because I think these challenges are not shared by our countries. I think these are global challenges. So to think about a little bit about the role of the media, I would say that we've had a hard time using the right wording to start with. It took us too long to call lies, lies. We were afraid of doing that. And I think we're afraid of doing that because we're reporting on polarized contexts. We're afraid that people think that we're taking sides, but by not doing that, we are actually taking sides. We need to call things by their names. When a politician tells a lie, we need to state that this is a lie. I also think that we need to figure out how not to be manipulated by these politicians, how not to make our work their platform, how we can report on them without giving them a platform. This kind of politics, they can manipulate us, they can benefit from our platforms, even when we are criticizing them. And I think this is a lesson that we haven't learned yet. In Brazil, media had a very hard time. It took us very long to call the Bolsonaro government far right. We at Nexo, we were one of the first outlets to do so. And we did that not because of any ideological reference. We did that sustained by political science reference. Literature describes governments as Bolsonaro's governments or as a far-right government. So why couldn't we call them? As I said, we need to use the proper wording while describing this kind of politicians. So I think that I could describe his government as a very violent one towards journalism. I also think that we need to learn how to act, how to report, and how to rethink our strategies facing this sort of governments, because they won't go away. We have elections in 3 years, and we will have to deal with the same scenario.
Thank you so much. I think that point about how to react segues nicely into Asha. Apologies, I didn't introduce you earlier, my bad. But you founded a particularly innovative organization in Kenya, Debunk Media, that's really taken a step back and looked at how can we effectively cover elections and how can we handle some of this disinformation. I love that you said recently that Kenya's always in campaign mode, and you've had to sort of break that cycle. And I think you and your team have really come up with some innovative ways to do that, and also partner with other media groups. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks for everyone being here. I think, Jessica, before I answer your question, it's very important for people to understand the Kenyan context when it comes to elections. Because if anyone has followed Kenyan elections, they're often very dramatic. We had an election last year in August, and I mean, the election observers said that it was fairly free and fair, and you know, Kenya is deemed as a very democratic country in the context of Africa as a region and many developing nations. But it was very dramatic, especially from a journalism perspective. I mean, by the time they were announcing the winner of the presidential election, the head of the electoral body was almost getting kidnapped from the venue. There was chaos in the room, like physical violence. 4 commissioners in the electoral body had actually branched off and disowned the results, and only 3 commissioners said, we back these results. You know, the election, of course, went into the Supreme Court, it was disputed, and the president was declared. 7 months later, we're still sort of in this post-election, really surreal world. But for me, I really reflect on the role of media, because last year, the media in Kenya was largely a spectator in this election. Their agenda-setting role had clearly diminished. In the last 2 elections before last year's, I was in the mainstream newsrooms. I was working for Legacy Media, and of course branched out during the pandemic and launched Debunk Media, which is the youngest newsroom in Kenya. We tried to do some innovative projects, tried to write profiles on presidential candidates, tried to sort of like, you know, help with narrative building, trying to sort of like create a center where we're not having these polarized discussions, but where we can discuss the election, politics, pop culture, society in general, from this central point where we don't have to fight. Let's just talk about what's going on. But if you'll allow me, Jessica, I think that while Kenyan media finds itself in this spot because of all the challenges we're all facing, financial challenges, challenges of trust and credibility, I think that the Kenyan media finds itself in this position because of certain decisions that they made in previous elections. So just a quick breakdown of what's happened in Kenya between 2010 and 2020, because that was a very important decade in Kenya and in Kenyan democracy. In 2010, we passed a new constitution. It was perhaps the most, you know, lively and optimistic period for Kenyans. Everyone thought we're now going to have a really good democracy. In 2013, Uhuru Kenyatta and the person who became his deputy were at the International Criminal Court facing charges of crimes against humanity. They were running for president in that year. Of course, you know Uhuru Kenyatta because he has the resources. His father was the first president in Kenya. He employed the services of Cambridge Analytica, who of course used Kenya as sort of like this project where they tested, you know, how they would go into social media, sort of monitor audience needs and fears, and then launch these social media campaigns. When he became president, he then systematically really eroded the influence of the media. First, by imposing laws. In 2013, during the Westgate Mall attack, media reported that soldiers went into the mall and looted. So Parliament passed a law which then imposed very harsh penalties for journalists and media houses who violated ethics, right? By 2018, perhaps the most drastic move was government removing advertising revenue. 70% of advertising revenue in Kenya came from government at the time. So they created this government advertising agency, which would then pick and choose which media house that they would give advertising revenue to, right? And so that meant that the legacy media houses lost a lot of the very critical revenue that they needed. So there's a lot of examples to give as to how the media was eroded. So as journalists observing what is happening throughout that decade, then what happens in the 2013 and the 2017 elections? Media picked sides. You literally had some media owners who would decide that this is our candidate of choice, and you would see it in the reporting of that media house, that they're siding with this side or this specific candidate. And that sort of created this increasing polarization in society, where there were no facts, like my colleagues say. You could not call lies as they are, where you could find newspapers covering one candidate more than the other candidate. And so 2-3 elections later, the culmination is this boiling point where social media is the preferred avenue of political discourse, where you're called fake news, where you don't have money to report, where journalists are being fired, where 70% of reporters in the newsroom have never covered an election. And so media looks at this, sorry to use this word, but cluster mess, and wonders, how did we get here? So that was just a long route to describe how, as journalists, we need to really reflect on the moment and what that means for the future. How do you cover this election? What decisions do you make? And how does that affect the next election 5 years on?
Thank you so much. I want to pick up on that idea of picking sides, because I think particularly in Poland, where we've seen the repolarization and sort of nationalist sentiment, which ripples down so that if you're just interviewing an opposition figure or a critical voice, that you're immediately called out as being biased. How do you even operate in that kind of environment where trying to provide both sides or trying to provide equal time to people in the politics discourse means that you start attracting these attacks of saying that you're anti-nationalist and part of that wider sort of talking point from the leaders there?
It's a very good question, a tough one, because I will provide you with two good information today. I know you are tired with bad news, and I hope that two things about Poland can be quite optimistic. But first, I have to say that when I was a young journalist, when I was starting my career, and then Poland was a democratic country, I used to believe that objectivity, not picking sides, was one of the most important values in my job. And while getting older, I was trying as an editor to teach this rule to the journalists. But with time, when democracy in Poland went under serious threat, I changed my perspective, and at the moment I think that neutrality is somehow fake, that you can't be neutral when reporting about some issues, like for example democracy threat, but also at the moment in Poland the biggest events that are happening is war in Ukraine, and we just can't be neutral. This would be like pretending that there is some, the truth is somewhere in the middle, while it's usually where it is. Yeah. So that is my that's how my perspective changed in last year. And this last year in Poland, I mean by that 8 years of a far-right government that openly admits that free press, free independent journalism doesn't suit into their landscape. So in these 8 years, they developed two major two kinds of propaganda. First was like in Turkey. It rings a bell when I hear about you saying about your public television. It's very similar. It has always, the public television and public radio has always been a trophy for all the political parties coming to rule. But this one went a few steps further. So when they took power, they exchanged all the bosses, first of all the editors, and then the rest of the crew decided to go on their own or were fired. So all the journalists were gone, and who came were the families and friends of the far-right politicians. So they are maybe not very professional, they make funny mistakes, but they are very consequent in providing a very hard propaganda. But our government at some point realized that it's not working well enough, because some people, after living 25 years in a democracy, were kind of immune to this kind of hard propaganda and were doubting it. So the government decided to buy a big chain of media outlets from a German publisher. When I say big, I mean 500 outlets, local outlets, both paper and digital. And they started to this other kind of soft propaganda. So a tabloid way, not very openly pro-government, but very effective. And the third thing they do is financing media that like to make interviews with government, and they give ads to the media who don't ask difficult questions. And being impartial here is really difficult, because the good news I want to give you is that there are free independent media in Poland now. When it comes to getting to the readers and the audience, we are not the majority for sure, but we are quite strong. We do investigative journalism, and we try to check what the government does, but it's not easy, because our answers are not, our questions are not answered. So we do not have access to public data. We can't check all the financing, and it's getting more difficult. The other thing is that government and public institutions take legal actions against us. When it comes to my outlet, it's usually lawsuits. We've had like more than 100 of lawsuits from the government. At the moment, there are more than 50 active ones. All of them are not really to prove that we make mistakes, but just to torment us. The lawsuit in Poland can last even 5 years. It costs a lot of money. And my newspaper and website, we are a big institution, so we can do it. Yeah, we have our legal department. It's costing more and more, but the real problem is that many smaller media outlets in Poland were so tormented with those lawsuits, they simply stopped doing proper journalism. So this is a real tragedy. Yeah.
That's a lot. Sapira, I'm going to come to you next, because I feel like India is kind of like on a fast track for all of this, particularly with the legal threats, the mob attacks on journalists with supporters or online trolls picking up those talking points that the media, anti-nationalist or this sort of anti-Hindu sentiment that's sort of creating fear around elections. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What is it like to be a journalist in that moment?
Thanks, Jessica. It's great to be on a panel with journalists from 5 continents. Well, yes, India has slipped 21 points on the Press Freedom Index in the 9 years that Narendra Modi government has been in power. We are currently ranked 161 below Afghanistan. And if you're wondering why that's the case, well, just a small example. Earlier this year, the tax authorities swooped down on the offices of BBC a month after it aired a documentary critical of Narendra Modi. When it comes to covering elections, Jessica, I think in the Indian context, more than actually covering the elections, what I worry about is, are we doing a good job covering what's happening between elections? The government talks up the fact that we are the world's largest democracy, which we are, if it goes by sheer numbers of people voting. In next year's big election, the national election coming up in 2024, nearly 1 billion people will be casting their votes. But democracy isn't just, the act of voting. What matters immensely is the conditions under which people vote. And there are very serious concerns. Again, like many other panelists spoke about their countries, in India as well, there isn't any longer a level playing field in politics. The ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, has amassed enormous advantages over its opponents by the sheer use and abuse of state power. Just to give you a few ways in which this has happened, they've come up with something like an instrument, a legal instrument called electoral bonds, which allows corporates to anonymously donate to political parties. So in India, we no longer know who's donating to the ruling party, and this would be a scandal in any other democracy, but in India, this is currently legally sanctioned. There's the misuse of investigative agencies. We at Scroll, we did a story looking at the way the money laundering law has been turbocharged to go after opponents. Searches conducted under that law have jumped 26 times since Modi came to power. Of the 4,700 cases filed under that law, nearly half have been filed in just the past 5 years. And there are many other ways in which this is happening, including the capture of media. I mean, currently, almost all of mainstream media in India is establishment media. It amplifies the government's narrative. Worse, it acts as a hound dog. It goes after critical independent voices. So we're basically, again, in independent media working with our backs to the wall. But to me, it seems, the way we can do this, the way we can put the spotlight on abuse of power, and not just do this around the time of elections, but do it throughout, is to build, a relationship of trust with our audiences. And we've really agonized about this at Scroll. How do we do this? We're a very small newsroom. We're just about 25 journalists. And there's several other small newsrooms like ours, mostly digital. And we're really in this sort of sea of mainstream media that is totally amplifying the government narrative. We're like just a few spots that sort of question what the government is saying. We kind of realized that we're mostly ending up sounding like we're reacting to the government. And some years ago, we started brainstorming about it, that we really need to be also in a constructive mode and build this relationship of trust with our readers by not just covering stories about politics, but a pretty wide spectrum. So we write about gender, we write about labor, we write about climate change, we write about subjects that readers are intimate with, are familiar with. And when they see that on those subjects that they're very familiar with, that they sort of know really well on a personal level, what we're saying resonates with them, then it also means that they trust us on high-impact political investigations. And so that's essentially been the process for us to work our way through this time when things are looking pretty dismal in India.
It's interesting when you talk about trust, and I wonder how it's been for all of you with this sort of discrediting of media. Are your reporters on the ground being confronted with harassment and attacks, particularly, I know like the online sphere is always particularly brutal around elections, particularly towards female journalists, but how is that feeding into audiences? Is there less trust in your organizations, and has that changed, particularly in Kenya and Brazil where you had changes in leadership? Is the environment getting any better?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily getting any better, and we need to take into account that Bolsonaro had almost 50% of the votes. So we have an extremely large part of the country that still supports him or his vision. So we are a pretty divided country. I think there's a question that remains, is like, can we think about media organizations as political actors? And I think this is the question that challenges the idea of trust. I think this is a question that is easier to answer when we're talking about political candidates. No, we're not there to support this or that political candidate. And I think there's an interesting piece on Email Lab saying how fewer American media organizations are willing to endorse candidates because of the effects that it have. But I think this is a harder question to answer when democracy is at stake. So we're here not to defend a specific candidate, but are we here to defend democracy? And I would say absolutely yes. And then it takes us to another question with the false equivalences that sometimes are built, because you need to report on every candidate, but not every candidate affiliates him or herself to democratic principles. So I think that all the challenges that emerge from this complexity, this complex scenario, puts us in a very fragile position if we don't have a clear vision of how we're going to deal with that. It puts us in a very delicate position when it comes to trust. So this, I would say that I think is one of the biggest questions that we need to answer as media organizations. The other thing in relationship to trust, I would say that platforms have contributed not only misinformation that is shared via platforms. I think that the behavior of platforms as corporations have contributed to promote distrust around media. Brazil is now discussing legislation on regulating platforms, and the kind of lobby that they performed was brutal, and it showed us that their interests are above everything. I think that it challenges our democracies. The kind of narrative that was built is that the internet is a free place, is a place for freedom of expression, free ideas, against the hegemony. Is this a word in English? Hegemony? Against journalism, that hegemonic view of journalism. So see where we've been placed. We are no longer the place of freedom of expression, freedom of ideas. We're controlling the speech. This was a narrative created by platforms to fight against regulation in Brazil. So I think that we have to take them into account by compromising the work and the trust that the audience has on our work.
No, yeah, I completely agree. I think what happened in Kenya is that the sort of like the infrastructure that Cambridge Analytica put in 2013 became a very useful tool for politicians after they left, because there were people who were trained on sort of like, you know, knowing the algorithms, learning the algorithms, and then using that for social media campaigns for politicians. So today in Kenya, a politician doesn't need to come to a TV show. They don't need to give an interview. Last election, they did not even need to show up for the presidential debate. The man who's president today did not show up for the presidential debate. What they have is they just have these very, very intricate, very powerful networks on social media that are run by young people, people who know the social media language, people who know how to rope in audiences. And that's one of the reasons why media has been relegated to the sidelines, because we were also really slow to innovate. Kenyan media was really slow to digitize. You still have newspapers who prioritize the print version vis-a-vis the digital version. And that's sort of like the ecosystem that we find ourselves in. So you won't find harassment of journalists in the context of other places where you'll find journalists perhaps being murdered or jailed or followed. There are very few cases of that in Kenya, and that's usually for the more investigative journalists. What you'll find is, you know, the bots, these sort of like groups of people who run politicians' disinformation campaigns will target you online. They will discredit you. They will actually own the narrative even before you break the story. It doesn't also help that Facebook, for example, which is one of the more popular platforms in terms of numbers, shadow bans news outlets, right? Your stories are not going to be at the top of the algorithm. If anything, they're going to be more hidden. On Twitter, another thing that happened in Kenya was a co-option of the elite. So people who would help the country make sense of things, lawyers, journalists, professors, have also been co-opted into this sort of like political conspiracy to take sides. So you can imagine as this audience member trying to just make sense of what is happening with politics, being in the middle of all of that chaos and not knowing where to turn to. So I think right now the media is just at a place where we're rebuilding trust, rebuilding credibility. It's almost just like going back to the basics and trying to figure out where did we go wrong and how do we do better moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah. There's a lot to say on this.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's so interesting to listen to all the panelists, because everything echoes. It's incredible how there is a formula to control the narrative, to control people, to control media. But what I would like to say is that in countries like, for example, Turkey, where you have where the presidency and parliament are hand in hand, if they're acting together, when we talk about bringing restrictions or controlling disinformation, everything becomes too blurry. For example, we're talking about the way narratives of disinformation floating in social media, affecting people, and there needs to be a fight against it, but then the government has just recently introduced this disinformation law, and there's a special unit that prints out a disinformation bulletin basically focusing on critical content against the government. So the terms lose their meanings. They redefine the terms in ways that will serve their political interests. So I think it's a hard fight to explain people what really even the basics are, but there is this danger. For example, I wouldn't bore you with numbers, but to see what you're talking about, how journalists assaulted the people who should be reaching out to public to put things into right corners. 240, this is from a Journalists Association report from 2021. 241 journalists were put on trial in that year. 73 journalists were detained. 1 radio broadcaster was killed. Later, another one added, so two journalists were killed. 115 journalists were physically assaulted in the street in their private premises. 44 journalists were in jail in 2021, but that number changes regularly. So you have this atmosphere of intimidation. And when you look at the newsroom, the journalists, almost 50% of them say they censor themselves in reporting the issues that they want to report. I think that is the danger that we're facing. As you say, I mean, physical assault is one thing, but more than looking at how many journalists in jail, we should look at the emotions of the journalists in exercising their profession. Are they free? Do they feel free? And that's a very hard question to answer in countries like Turkey. So what we're left with is stories, human stories. I think you mentioned it, like not political stories, but building trust, rebuilding trust through stories that will tell people that freedom of expression is not this vague term floating in the air. It applies in their world. For example, there was this huge train crash that killed dozens of people. So some journalists made it a mission to follow up stories of each and every passenger, how families fought in court, what kind of injustices they faced, because no one resigned, nobody took responsibility. It was just an accident, a case of fate. So when people read about that personal story of injustice, I think it is more relevant for them to see how important access to information is, access to free trial is. And I especially mention trial because when you look at the pillars of democracy, 2 of them is justice, judiciary, and media. If you dominate these 2 pillars, then there's no accountability. You can report as many stories as you want on one misdoing, injustice, but when you go to court, if there is no accountability, then how can you prove that there is something wrong? My colleague from El Salvador was saying that the courts were manipulated and they have this mounting numbers of cases and the cost of, lawyers are going up and all that. Exactly that. I mean, I think it is the way we have to explain to public that this is important in our lives as much as the judiciary is the media. They go hand in hand. We can't single out media in democracies.
Thank you. I was just going to say, we've only got 10 minutes left, and I'd like to talk a little bit about solutions first, but I know both of you have. You'd like to comment on those?
But I would like to also express gratitude to you, Jessica, that you gathered here as, although we are not men, yeah? You could think, looking at us, that in media, women are in charge, and that big media are represented by women normally. We are all from media. We know that it's not like that, and I'm really grateful that you let us speak here. And I would like to mention one thing about gender, that when it comes to online harassment, it's much easier for many politicians to do it towards women. And also campaigns, you mentioned bots on the internet, are often targeted on women. So female journalists often suffer from that. I wanted to mention it. One thing that is also probably very specific about Poland and my region is Russian Secret Service propaganda, and we have to deal with it every day. This is also a part of war that is happening in Ukraine, and somehow they are making the polarization that you mentioned in the beginning even bigger. So their goal at the moment is to create an impression that we differ inside even more than we really do. So that our opinions are so different that we generally cannot live in one country.
Well, it really seems like there's some authoritarian playbook that's being shared across the world. And so I guess it's really important for us to also share ideas here. Well, just to respond to some of the things said, well, I agree that there's obviously a lot of online harassment and targeting women journalists. But it's always useful to keep in mind that these are social media armies at work, that these are organized political actors, and they're not representative of the public at large. And that there is still, at least in India, we think, a section of the public that's open to hearing, views, voices that go against the establishment narrative. And we, in fact, discovered very recently that while we're, all of these small independent media outlets in India, we're all working autonomously, sometimes working across different cities. We often felt like we're sort of throwing pebbles in the ocean, that there is this mighty mainstream media machine and that our voices get drowned out. So in a recent election, we came together, 5 news organizations, and we put out an election show which had decent viewership. And I mean, I'd admit that it was tough work collaborating with 4 other news organizations, but you can imagine sometimes it's hard to get a consensus within a newsroom, and then you put 5 newsrooms in a room, and it can get pretty challenging. And yet it showed that if we collaborate, if there's solidarity in this kind of hostile media environment, we can still get independent journalism heard. So maybe one way forward is to think of more collaborations, no matter how challenging they are.
I think that's good, and I'd like to go to Asha, because I'd like you to just talk a little bit through one of the innovations you had coming up to the elections, where you really tried to neutralize the scene and just provide just very objective approach, even with the illustrations, how you presented the candidates. I think it's just that when you talk about going back to basics, really captured what we could and maybe should be doing as journalists.
Yeah, so one of the things that we noticed was that there was only 1 or 2 candidates in the presidential election who was getting actual coverage. You would have thought that there were only 2 presidential candidates. At the time we launched the project, there were 12 people who wanted to become president. And so what we did is we wrote profiles, which is something that you don't see in the media, this sort of like slower journalism, 8,000 word profiles of who is this man, where did they go to school, how are they as a kid, just to sort of like show the voter, who are you voting for? They have their political history and everything, but who is this person at the core? Because most of the time, a person's history, a person's life is what informs the decisions that they make when they get into office. And so we were very deliberate down to the presentation that we drew illustrations of all the 12 presidential candidates. We put them in red ties, white shirt, gray suit, just to show we are equalizing all of you. It doesn't matter who's the billionaire, and it doesn't matter who is the person with a seeing disorder, because there was someone who could not see who was running for president. And then, because we are a smaller media house, we partnered with one of the national newspapers to publish these profiles. So every Wednesday, we were guaranteed the front page of the newspaper to run these profiles. And we, when we launched the project, the newspaper said that they had to print an additional 10,000 copies of the paper just because of how popular those profiles were, because everyone wants to read about their preferred candidate. The combination of that is that one of the people we interviewed is now the Attorney General. One of them is the Foreign Affairs Minister. One of them is the Speaker of Parliament. One of them is like sort of like the Prime Minister. It's called the Premier Cabinet Secretary. And that is on the record that today, if you want to know about this person, you can go and read on these 8,000 words. Because they're also men who've served in government for many years. We sat with them for like 5 hours. Everyone loves to speak about themselves. And what happened is they started telling us about intrigues in government that we never knew, right? One person who was the spokesperson, government spokesperson, told us about this meeting where they decided to put a port city in a specific region. And he basically disclosed that they were in a meeting and someone decided, why don't we just put it in your area, right? No facts, no logic. It was just like dishing out this sort of like, big government contracts. So the profiles were very nuanced. They were very loaded with information. And I think you could see even with the audience reactions that, hey, look, this is very interesting content. And it sort of removed the conversation away from all the polarized debate. After the election, the other thing that we've done, if you go to the website debunk.media, you'll see a section called Public Square. So we've sort of like recreated the center. So now let's have these conversations in an orderly, in a respectful way, right? In an honest way. And we did a call out. We told journalists, activists, lawyers, professors, anyone who wants to write an opinion piece can then send it to us. And it's on anything, people, pop culture, politics. And so we've reconstructed this center where debates that would ordinarily be very polarized on social media can now be had from a very neutral perspective, a toned down perspective. And we've had like now 50 people writing in. A lot of people who used to write for the big newspapers and left because they didn't feel that the newspapers identified with their thoughts and ideologies anymore. And it's sort of like bringing this, what we used to see in our newsrooms 10, 20 years ago, that we're all a people, we're all one society. We have difficulties, we go through the motions, but we can sit down and talk about the issues on the table without wanting to fight each other, right? So those are like two innovations that I can give as sort of like an example of how Debunk as a younger newsroom sort of like pulled away from the rest and said, let's do journalism a little bit differently, which is just going back to the basics, funny enough.
I really like that idea and love the idea of just opening up that conversation, like reconnecting with our audiences as well and hearing from them and showing, this is why we're here. I'm not sure, do we have any time for questions, or are we a little bit close?
Out of time. We could do one quick question maybe.
Okay. And then we'll...
Sorry. Before we jump to the question, can we just show this as you were talking about introducing presidential candidates? Sorry, can we put this up?
How do we...
Scott,
There was a Oh, it's up on the screen now, just in terms
Okay.
of like...
So this is from one of the pro-government private channels, and this is basically their introduction of the vote card. There are only 2 candidates. I mean, it's not the end of the world if you spell the name of the person. And it just says the other candidate, and it says this is how you vote. This is where things are, just visually.
I think that's a really nice way to end this session as well, to say like...
I'm sorry, I mean, I'm not happy doing this. This is really embarrassing. It's really sad. It's tragic and sad, but this is what happens if you don't hold on to your space. And I hear my colleague talking about, impartial journalism, and many of my colleagues back home are frustrated because they are threatened by their own space and they have to take a side, and that side is their very existence.
Thank you. I think we are just going to have to wrap up. I would say come and find us after the panel. I know there's one right here, but this is, I know we all have a lot more we would like to discuss about this, and there's so much more to say on this subject. But thank you all for coming today, and thank you so much for sharing your insights and taking time away from really busy schedules right now. Thank you.